Quite interesting, isn't it? How we make sense of the world? We don't just see a random jumble of things. We see patterns, connections, and systems. This is where a rather revolutionary idea called structuralism comes in. Imagine for a moment that every story, every myth, and even every social custom has a hidden skeleton, an underlying framework that gives it shape and meaning. Structuralism is the intellectual equivalent of an X-ray machine for human culture. It suggests that the individual parts of any system, be it a language, a myth, or a menu, only make sense when you understand their relationship to the whole. It's not about what each piece, but how it fits together with everything else. The real importance of this idea was that it shifted the focus of study in a rather dramatic way. Before structuralism, scholars in the humanities were often terribly interested in the author's biography, the historical context of a single painting, or the unique genius behind a novel. Structuralism, however, politely suggested that perhaps the individual creator wasn't the most interesting part of the story. Instead, it proposed that we should look at the larger, impersonal systems of rules and conventions that the creator was working within. It's like studying the rules of chess rather than focusing on a single brilliant move made by a grandmaster. The move is only brilliant because of the rules. This approach offered a fresh scientific-seeming lens through which to view the often messy and subjective world of the humanities. It promised a way to find objective, universal patterns in the vast tapestry of human culture. If you could decode the underlying structure of one myth, you might find it shares that same structure with a myth from a completely different culture on the other side of the world. Suddenly, you weren't just looking at isolated stories. You were looking at the fundamental grammar of human thought itself. This was a grand, ambitious project that aimed to uncover the deep logic that secretly governs how we think, communicate, and organize our society. So in essence, structuralism was a bold attempt to find the universal building blocks of meaning. It argued that surface-level differences in cultures often conceal a shared, underlying logic. This perspective was incredibly exciting because it suggested that all human activities, from cooking a meal to writing a poem, could be analyzed in a similar way. The goal was to move beyond mere description and to understand the deep, invisible structures that make meaning possible in the first place. It was less about the specific words on the page and more about the grammatical system that allowed those words to be written at all. A truly fascinating turn of events in intellectual history. The whole enterprise really kicks off with a Swiss linguist named Ferdinand de Saussure, a chap who, rather fascinatingly, never actually published the book that made him famous. His students compiled his lecture notes after his death into the Saussure had a simple but profound idea. Language is a system of signs. He proposed we separate the messy individual act of speaking, which he called, from the underlying system of rules and conventions of a language, which he called. It was the hidden social contract of language that he thought was the proper object of scientific study. This was the structure that made all our individual utterances possible. But he didn't stop there. Saussure then broke down the linguistic sign itself into two parts, the and the. The signifier is the sound image, like the word tree, and the signified is the concept it represents, the idea of a tree. The crucial point, he argued, is that the relationship between these two is completely arbitrary. There is nothing inherently tree-like about the sound tree, we just agree that it means that. This simple observation had enormous consequences, as it meant that meaning wasn't inherent in things but was created by a system of conventions and relationships. It was a revolutionary way of thinking about how we communicate. Furthermore, Saussure claimed that concepts are defined not by their positive content but by their difference from other concepts. We understand what hot means because we know it is not cold. We know what cat means because it is not dog, rat, or mat. Meaning, therefore, is purely relational. Each word in a language is like a chess piece. Its value comes not from its material substance, but from its position on the board and its relationships with all the other pieces. This idea, that meaning is generated through a system of differences, became the absolute bedrock of structuralist thought and would soon be applied to almost everything. So, to put it simply, Saussure gave future thinkers three powerful tools. First, the idea of looking for the underlying system rather than the individual event. Second, the concept of the arbitrary sign, which separates meaning from the real world and places it firmly within a cultural system. And third, the notion that meaning is created by difference. These ideas formed a blueprint, a sort of instruction manual for how to be a structuralist, and thinkers in other fields soon realized they could use this very same manual to analyze their own subjects, from kinship systems to fashion magazines. Once Saussure's ideas were out in the world, they spread like wildfire through the humanities. One of the most prominent figures to pick up the torch was the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. He looked at the vast and seemingly chaotic collection of myths from different cultures around the world and had a brilliant insight. He suggested that beneath their bewildering variety of characters and plots, all myths were built from the same fundamental building blocks, which he called. These were basic units of meaning that were organized into pairs of opposites, or binary oppositions: raw versus cooked, nature versus culture, life versus death. Lévi-Strauss argued that the purpose of myth was to mediate these fundamental contradictions of human existence. By analyzing the structure of these myths, he believed he could uncover the universal structure of the human mind itself. It was a breathtakingly ambitious claim. He wasn't just cataloging stories, he was trying to map the very logic that governs human thought across all cultures and all times. Suddenly, anthropology wasn't just about describing exotic customs, it was about discovering the deep universal grammar of society. He applied this method to everything from kinship systems to culinary practices, seeing them all as languages to be decoded. Another key figure was the French literary critic Roland Barthes. In his early work, Barthes took Saussure's linguistic model and applied it to the world of popular culture. He famously analyzed things like professional wrestling, advertisements for soap powder, and the Citroën DS car as if they were complex sign systems. He showed how these everyday objects and practices were communicating subtle ideological messages, serving as modern-day myths. For Barthes, a wrestling match wasn't just a sport, it was a grand spectacle of good versus evil, a language communicating ideas about justice and suffering. This approach turned the whole world into a text waiting to be read. Barthes also famously declared the death of the author. This wasn't a morbid pronouncement, but a structuralist argument. He suggested that when we read a text, we shouldn't worry about what the author intended to say. The author, he argued, was merely a channel for the vast system of language and cultural conventions that existed long before them. The real meaning of a text was to be found not in the author's mind, but in the structure of the language itself and the way it was interpreted by the reader. This radically shifted the focus of literary criticism away from biography and towards the impersonal workings of the text itself. The impact of structuralism on the humanities was, without a doubt, profound. Its greatest legacy was shifting the focus from the individual to the system. The romantic idea of the lone genius author was replaced by an understanding that every creator works within a pre-existing framework of rules, genres, and conventions. This allowed for a more systematic and less impressionistic analysis of cultural products. Scholars began looking for the grammar of stories, the syntax of films, and the language of fashion. It provided a powerful, unified methodology for fields that had previously seemed disparate, bringing a sense of scientific rigor to the study of culture. However, the movement was not without its critics. Some found the structuralist approach to be far too rigid and deterministic. By focusing so intently on universal, unchanging structures, it seemed to ignore history, social change, and the agency of individuals to challenge or alter those structures. It was accused of being ahistorical, of freezing human culture into a static, timeless system. Furthermore, who gets to decide what the fundamental binary oppositions are? The method could seem overly neat, forcing the messy reality of human experience into a pre-made intellectual box, often reflecting the biases of the, mostly European male analyst. These very criticisms eventually gave rise to the next major intellectual movement, post-structuralism. Thinkers like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, who had started as structuralists, began to question the very idea of a stable, objective structure. They argued that these systems were not as neat and tidy as Lévi-Strauss or Barthes had suggested. Instead, they were full of contradictions, gaps, and instabilities. Post-structuralism didn't completely reject the idea of structures, but it deconstructed them, showing how they were fluid, contested, and entangled with power. In a way, post-structuralism was born from structuralism's own internal contradictions. Despite these critiques and evolutions, the echo of structuralism's big idea is still with us today. It fundamentally changed the questions we ask in the humanities. We now take it for granted that culture is a system of signs and that we should look for underlying patterns. The idea that meaning is relational and constructed, rather than natural and inherent, is a cornerstone of modern thought. While we may no longer believe in a single universal key to all mythologies, the structuralist impulse to look for the hidden systems that shape our world remains an indispensable tool for anyone trying to understand what it means to be human. It taught us to look under the hood, and for that, we ought to be quite grateful.